The palace rose like a mirage upon the French countryside, a monument of gold and glass that seemed less built than conjured. Versailles shimmered in the morning sun, its endless windows glinting like watchful eyes, its marble walls glowing as if kissed by heaven itself. To the traveler approaching its gates, it was not merely a residence but a vision, a promise that France had ascended beyond mortal limits, that Louis XIV, the Sun King, had harnessed light itself and trapped it within stone. But beauty can lie. Step past the gleaming facade and the illusion unravels. The air, once thought perfumed with the scent of roses, was heavy with something darker, sharper, an odor that clawed at the throat. Human waste seeped into the corridors, clinging to the cold marble, saturating the wooden floors until they groaned beneath the weight of filth. Behind silken curtains, courtiers relieved themselves, too many bodies pressed into a palace never designed to contain them. The gardens, those sprawling, manicured triumphs of symmetry and art, hid 1,000 unspoken degradations. Beneath the fountains and statues, the hedges themselves became latrines. Picture it. Chandeliers sparkling above, while beneath them nobles step carefully to avoid what should never have been there. The Hall of Mirrors, built to blind ambassadors with splendor, reflected not only majesty but the invisible truth, stench, disease, and humiliation lingering in every shadow. Perfume did not sweeten the air. It battled it, like incense rising futilely in a tomb. This was Versailles, dazzling to the eye, revolting to the flesh. The Sun King's golden dream was a palace where velvet gowns dragged through dirt, where the scent of jasmine mixed with the acrid bite of excrement, where civilization itself seemed to buckle under the weight of its own pretense. How could the most beautiful palace in Europe become one of its dirtiest secrets? Before we dive into the filth behind the gold, ask yourself, if this story shocks you already, isn't that worth a subscribe to Echoes of Time? And if not, I'd love to hear why down in the comments. Louis XIV was not content to rule a kingdom. He sought to rule an image. To him, power was not merely exercised through armies or decrees, but through spectacle. Versailles was to be more than stone and marble. It would be a theater in which every noble, every ambassador, every rival monarch would become both actor and audience, bound by the light of his supremacy. When construction began in 1661, it was not on a palace fit for thousands, but on a modest hunting lodge. Yet, in the Sun King's imagination, this unremarkable retreat would swell into the very axis of European civilization. He ordered gardens vast enough to suggest eternity, halls long enough to humble kings, mirrors large enough to reflect the universe itself. Every line of architecture bent toward a single purpose, to glorify the man who called himself the sun. But Versailles was not only a monument, it was a weapon. By relocating his court here, Louis dragged the nobility from their ancestral strongholds and placed them under his gaze. In gilded halls, power was not won on the battlefield but in ritual, in ceremony, in the subtle humiliations of bowing and waiting and pleasing the king. He starved the aristocracy of independence and fed them instead with spectacle, trapping them in a prison made of mirrors and gold. Yet beneath the glittering vision lay a fatal blindness. Versailles was never meant to house 20,000 souls. It lacked the veins and arteries of a true city, no sewage, no proper water system, no infrastructure to sustain the teeming court that would soon crowd its chambers. In his hunger for grandeur, Louis XIV had overlooked the most basic truth. A palace may blind the eye, but it cannot silence the body. And the needs of thousands of bodies, unmet and ignored, would rot the dream from within. This was the paradox at Versailles' heart. The grander the dream became, the more fragile it was. Every new wing added more magnificence, but also more mouths, more bodies, more waste. The very project meant to prove France's supremacy was, in its foundations, designed to collapse under its own weight. Before we trace how beauty curdled into filth, ask yourself, what do you think lasts longer, the illusion of power or the truth of decay? If this question haunts you, subscribe to Echoes of Time to follow it further. And if you choose not to, tell me why in the comments. I want to hear the reasons behind your silence. Versailles had been imagined as the pinnacle of civilization, but in truth it possessed none of its foundations. There were no sewers hidden beneath its marble floors, no network of latrines to serve its thousands of residents. The palace had been built to dazzle the eye, not to sustain the body. And so, when life swelled within its walls, nature took its revenge. Nobles and servants alike were forced to improvise. Some slipped behind staircases and heavy curtains to relieve themselves in secret. Others had chamber pots emptied carelessly into corners, alcoves, or out of windows where the waste splattered against courtyards below. The famous gardens, those triumphs of geometry and control, became open-air latrines. Visitors strolled through hedges manicured into perfection, yet the air was tainted, the ground littered with evidence of desperation. The corridors, so carefully polished for ceremony, became slick with filth. Winter made the situation unbearable. When frost locked the gardens in ice and cold winds drove courtiers indoors, the waste no longer spilled outside. It gathered in stairwells, hallways, and salons where velvet and lace brushed against invisible rot. Even ritual, the very heart of Versailles' purpose, was poisoned by the stench. At the king's morning lever, when hundreds crowded into his chamber to watch him awaken and dress, the spectacle became an ordeal. Perfumed courtiers pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath heavy with wine and unwashed bodies, while the unmistakable reek of waste seeped into the ceremony. The pageant of power was reduced to a theater of discomfort. Letters and diaries whispered what etiquette would never admit. Madame de Maintenon, the king's companion, confessed that her chambers reeked no matter how much incense she burned, that her clothes absorbed the palace's odor until she was forced to change several times a day. The Duchess of Orleans described a ball where a noble, overcome by desperation, soiled himself before the glittering court. No one gasped, no one screamed. They simply pretended it had not happened, as if silence could erase the humiliation. This was Versailles in its truth, a place where ceremony continued even as filth seeped into every ritual, where appearances triumphed while bodies suffered, where the hunger for power silenced even the most basic cries for dignity. Would you have endured this life for a glimpse of power, or walked away in disgust? Tell me in the comments, and if you're still watching, why not subscribe to Echoes of Time so you don't miss the next untold story? Disease was inevitable. With every passing season, the waste that pooled in corridors and seeped into wooden floors became more than an indignity. It became a poison. By the late 1680s, dysentery tore through Versailles like a silent army. Courtiers collapsed in their chambers, fevered and delirious, their bodies racked by illness born of the very palace meant to embody perfection. Kitchens, set far from the grand halls, carried food along passageways rank with sewage. Meals, prepared to honor ambassadors and nobles, arrived tainted, and banquets meant to display magnificence often ended in sudden sickness. To dine at Versailles was to gamble with one's health. For the women of the court, the torments were relentless. Fashion demanded gowns of crushing weight, corsets laced until the ribs ached, layers of fabric that made even the simplest bodily relief nearly impossible. Many avoided drinking water altogether, choosing pain over humiliation. Some endured agonizing urinary infections, while others simply surrendered, soiling their garments in silence and masking their shame with overpowering perfumes. Beneath jewels and silk, their suffering was invisible, yet constant. Versailles celebrated them as ornaments of elegance, but in truth they were prisoners of clothing, of ceremony, of a palace designed without mercy. The winters deepened their torment. Versailles was vast and cold, its stone walls and endless galleries incapable of holding warmth. Water froze in basins, fingers numbed against the icy air. To wash was an act of courage, yet few dared to attempt it, for the cold made bathing unbearable. The perfumes that clouded the air were not luxuries but weapons, wielded desperately against the stench of unwashed bodies and festering halls. Behind every glittering celebration lay a hidden war against decay, a war Versailles always lost. And yet the nobles endured. They endured because endurance meant proximity to the king. To leave was to vanish from the theater of power, to risk irrelevance, to surrender the chance of favor or advancement. So they silenced their complaints. They smiled through sickness, bowed through infection, and danced in halls that reeked of rot. Privilege demanded obedience, and obedience demanded silence. Versailles became not only a palace of filth but a palace of submission, where the price of ambition was to suffer and pretend it was nothing. If these hidden torments leave you unsettled, ask yourself, would you have borne them for the chance to stand near the Sun King? If the answer is yes or no, share it in the comments. And if you wish to uncover more of these buried truths, subscribe to Echoes of Time so you never miss the shadows behind history's brightest lights. Louis XIV would not acknowledge the truth festering beneath his golden palace. Instead, he waged war against reality with fragrance. Perfumes, incense, fresh flowers. These became his weapons, scattered through chambers and corridors in an endless attempt to bury the stench beneath sweetness. But scent could only mask, never cleanse. The rot seeped through, a constant reminder that beauty was only a veneer. Versailles became a palace that dazzled the eye but assaulted the body. The scandals this created were whispered at first, then laughed at behind closed doors, and finally recorded in diaries that survive to this day. At a glittering ball, nobles pressed together in silks and lace. A high-ranking courtier suddenly lost control of his bowels. In full view of the assembly, the stench rose above the music, yet no one reacted. To acknowledge the humiliation would have been to expose Versailles itself. So the dancers turned their eyes away, pretending nothing had happened, while the shame hung in the air like smoke. Decades later, Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, ascended the palace's grand staircase in front of foreign ambassadors. Her silken white shoes slipped into something soft, foul, unmistakable. Human excrement stained her steps, her garments, her dignity, and before the horrified eyes of dignitaries, Versailles revealed its secret once more. The scandal was so great that a new rule was imposed. No more light-colored shoes in the palace. Yet even this decree was not a solution, only another layer of etiquette wrapped around filth. Versailles did not cleanse itself. It rewrote its rules to conceal the evidence. The palace's great hypocrisy was laid bare. In a place built to reflect power, appearances mattered more than truth. Versailles preferred to rot in silence rather than admit weakness. If Versailles shocks you so far, consider subscribing to Echoes of Time for more hidden truths. And if you don't feel like subscribing, let me know down below. What's holding you back? The palace that once proclaimed glory began to whisper decay. Versailles, with its mirrors and gold, became less a symbol of majesty than of aristocratic rot. The same walls that glittered for foreign dignitaries now carried a stench that spread beyond the court, drifting into rumor, into satire, into the minds of the people who starved beyond its gates. What had once been concealed as a private humiliation grew into a public weapon. Revolutionary pamphlets seized on the filth as metaphor. They painted Versailles not as the heart of France, but as its cesspool. Nobles perfumed in roses and musk were described as dancing knee-deep in their own waste, their silks hiding infections, their jewels glinting against rotting flesh. The image was irresistible. A ruling class so decadent it could not even preserve its own dignity. The palace that had been designed to awe Europe now stood as evidence of corruption so deep it had become physical, visible, and undeniable. Marie Antoinette, in her desperation to reclaim dignity, ordered bathrooms installed in her private quarters, tried to impose rules of cleanliness, tried to wash away centuries of stench. But her reforms came too late. Instead of appearing practical, they appeared indulgent. To the common people, struggling for bread, news of gilded bathtubs and perfumed baths seemed like mockery. The Queen's effort to rise above filth only widened the gulf between palace and people, feeding the flames of resentment. Versailles had become political dynamite. Every odor, every scandal, every whispered tale of waste was another spark tossed onto a nation already dry with anger. The palace no longer reflected the strength of monarchy. It revealed its decay. If these truths unsettle you, imagine how they sounded to the ears of a starving France. To follow their echoes into the storm that followed, subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you choose not to, tell me in the comments, what stops you from stepping deeper into history's darkest chambers? When the revolution finally erupted in 1789, Versailles stood like a golden carcass, magnificent from afar, but hollow within. The revolutionaries who surged through its gates expected opulence, jewels, treasures to plunder. What they found instead was a palace steeped in rot. The smell struck them before the sight did. Marble walls, once gleaming, had absorbed centuries of filth. Staircases hid piles of human waste. Curtains, tapestries, and carpets were stained and ruined beyond saving. The palace was not merely unsanitary, it was diseased, a biological hazard masquerading as civilization. Workers tasked with cleansing it uncovered literal tons of accumulated waste, packed into corners, stairwells, even the chambers of nobles. The task of reclaiming the palace stretched on for months, each day revealing just how deep the neglect had sunk. Versailles had not been a temple of light. It had been a golden coffin, sealing within it the rot of monarchy. To the people, this was not simply filth. It was proof that the monarchy itself was rotten to the core, unfit to govern, unworthy of survival. The very palace built to glorify absolute power now stood as the most damning evidence against it. Versailles collapsed not in flames or siege, but under the weight of its own contradictions. Splendor above, squalor below, until the mask finally broke. History shows us again and again that appearances can't hide reality forever. If you want to uncover more echoes of truth with me, hit subscribe. And if not, speak your mind in the comments. I want to know what stops you. Today, the Palace of Versailles gleams again. Its chandeliers sparkle. Its mirrors stretch endlessly. Its gardens bloom in perfect symmetry. Millions of visitors each year wander its corridors in awe, tracing their fingers along polished marble, gazing up at ceilings painted with gods and triumphs. Yet what they cannot see, what they cannot smell, is the truth. The filth has been scrubbed away. The waste, the sickness, the humiliation, all erased, replaced by curated perfection. Versailles has been restored as a monument to beauty, not remembered as the chamber of rot it once was. But the truth lingers in words, not walls. It survives in diaries written by women who endured silent humiliations, in letters from courtiers who confessed their disgust, in reports by ambassadors who mocked the stench of France's golden palace. These voices, hidden for centuries beneath the glitter, speak louder than marble or gold ever could. They remind us that Versailles was not simply a palace, but a warning carved into history. For the lesson of Versailles is stark. Grandeur without dignity is decay. A society that measures its greatness by mirrors and fountains, yet cannot provide the most basic needs of its people, is a society already rotting from within. The palace built to prove the immortality of a king instead revealed the mortality of a system. Behind every gilded wall, power was unraveling, one foul odor at a time. Versailles remains a symbol, but not of triumph. It endures as a golden mask stretched thin over centuries of filth, a reminder that unchecked power prefers illusion to truth, and that illusion cannot endure forever. The mirrors that once blinded Europe now reflect a deeper truth. No crown, no court, no empire can stand if it ignores the dignity of its own people. This was Versailles, the palace of dreams and decay. If you value stories that strip away the gold to show the truth, join us here at Echoes of Time by subscribing. And if you won't, tell me why in the comments. History is full of debate, and your voice matters too.